Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Terror over the Sinai. It's official. The Russian plane flying from Egypt was indeed a victim of terrorism. Who is really responsible remains unclear. Nonetheless, there can be no doubt much of the terrorism coming out of the Middle East today has its origins in the West. To CrossTalk the recent terror attacks, I'm joined by my guest, Mohammad Marandi in Tehran. He is an associate professor at the University of Tehran. In Charlottesville, we have David Swanson. He is the director of worldbeyondwar.org. And in London, we cross to Alexander Mercouris. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Mohammad, if I can go to you first here. It's official now that the airline that was flying from Egypt to Russia was the victim of a terrorist act. And the FSB here in Russia is offered a $50 million reward for further information about this tragic act that was done purposely. Obviously, that's the nature of terrorism. But let's talk about money flows, because when I read about the reward, I thought, well, that's a lot of money, but not nearly as much money that's being spread around by countries that we know who are giving money to ISIS and related groups. They've been doing it for years. It's not hard to find out about it. And we're still told that this is the scourge of mankind. Now, if you cut off those money flows and the assistance and the political cover, then that's showing a real interest in fighting these people here. Because what I hear coming out of Paris, London, and Washington is the same old, same old. What do you think?
Well, you're absolutely correct. I'd also like to add that the Western media, when the Russian plane was downed, they didn't seem actually to be too upset about it, which is, I think, quite disgusting. Just as Western media outlets, when the suicide bombings took place in Lebanon, they called it a Hezbollah bastion or Hezbollah stronghold, sort of justifying the attack indirectly. AFP, Reuters, United Press all use these terms. But you're absolutely correct. The Saudis, the Turkish government, they've been helping Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates, the ISIL group, over the past few years. This is something that the U.S. Vice President had admitted last October. And also General Flynn, the former head of the the Defense Intelligence Agency, the most important military intelligence gathering organization in the U.S., also admitted that the United States helped the rise of extremism from 2012. So the Americans, the Europeans, the dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, as well as Turkey, they've all been deeply involved in the rise of these organizations, and they're implicated. And indeed, the Americans have allowed ISIL to export oil to Turkey for a very long time now, and only after the Russian president said this publicly, that members of the G20 were aiding, and he showed pictures of tankers, huge queues of tankers, did the Americans finally bomb some of these tankers to sort of slow the flow of the oil and to lessen their...
It's really amazing because from the Russian side in dealing with all these issues, they just present facts, okay? If you can dispute them, but, you know, facts are very stubborn things. Alexander, if I can go to you and kind of echo what we just heard in Tehran. When the Russian airline went down, I would even say a lot of Western media was smug about it because, you know, this is the Russians get punished here. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, as we all speak on this program, it is Hezbollah, it is Iran, it is Assad, and the Syrian army and the Russian Air Force. They're fighting ISIS in these groups, all of these groups in Syria here. And all I hear is the same bluster coming out of Paris. Who knows to what degree they helped these people before these terrorist attacks. Unwittingly or wittingly, we might never find out. But at the same time, the West is more culpable in this than they ever want to admit. Go ahead, Alexander.
Well, indeed, because what has happened in Syria is that, of course, the West has two completely conflicting policies. It has the policy which it announces, which is to fight organizations like ISIL, and then there is its real policy, which is to topple the Syrian government. Those two policies are in contradiction, but it's quite clear that toppling the Syrian government is the actual priority. Because that is the priority, in reality, they have been helping these various groups to fight the Syrian government, which is why they have got steadily stronger. The Russians, President Putin pointed out how dangerous that was at the United Nations General Assembly. The Iranians have been saying the same thing. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has said it again. The trouble is, there are some people in Washington and London and Paris who are just not listening. And when you say that some of the people in the West indicated that they were actually pleased that the Russian aircraft was blown up because that was somehow a payback for Russia, we actually know from media reports that that's actually the view of some officials within the US government.
Yeah. You know, David, you know, one of the things in looking at the reaction, particularly like out of Paris here, but you know, there were terrorist attacks in Ankara, in Beirut, and we can go on and on about other people, other victims here. Of course, the West will focus primarily on the West for somehow it is somehow superior, I don't know. And again, as I'd like to echo from what we've heard earlier, when the Russian aircraft went down, I didn't see people putting Russian flags on their Facebook accounts. But anyway, you know, the reaction here is more of the same. This is over-militarization of foreign policy. And this is why it doesn't work. They see, when you're a hammer, the only thing you see in the world are nails. And this is a repeat of the mistakes of 9/11, after 9/11. Go ahead, weigh in there, because it seems a repeat to me.
Yeah, you see this incredible and appropriate sympathy for victims of violence in France, and you see it as very political and selective because you don't see it in the U.S. media and the Western media and the Western organizations for the Russian victims on that airplane, or for victims in Beirut, or for victims of larger scale terrorism, which is what the Pentagon and NATO do. It's terrorism by wealthier forces. But on the other hand, and you know, we ought to all be Russia and all be Lebanon, as we are all France. I mean, that we ought to extend that sympathy. On the other hand, you're absolutely right that mistakes are being repeated. After 9/11, the United States didn't say, this is blowback for our crimes and abuses and offenses. Let's stop occupying these people's countries. Let's make it worse. After this attack in France, the government of France, the president didn't say, this is actually a little tiny piece of a war being brought home that we're fighting elsewhere. Let's reconsider this war. And when that Russian airplane went down, quite possibly because of its bombing of people in Syria, the Russian government didn't say, hey, maybe let's not imitate the United States. Let's not do what the U.S. and NATO have been doing. Let's learn a lesson here and pull back and try a less violent approach than dropping bombs on people. No, the Russian media did exactly like the U.S. and the French media and said this is cause for escalating the bombing of Syria.
Okay, Mohammad, one of the things that's really quite interesting is that, you know, one of the biggest problems that the West has in dealing with the rest of the world is it can't see from the other point of view. I mean, if you're a resident of Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Syria, and all of the violence that is committed against your people by Western powers, and Western powers are so outraged when somebody uses violence against them, this is a time to unify. The Russian government, Vladimir Putin, has said we need a united front to take care of this scourge in Syria. We can all get together and do that, and then let the Syrian people decide what they want to do with themselves. That's a very simple, maybe simplistic formula, but it would work if there was a political will for it. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think that is the objective of the United States and the Europeans. Right now, they may be forced to deal with ISIL in a different way than before. In the past, they allowed it to thrive. Or they tried to manage it. But even now, we see that the United States continues to support other extremist groups, groups that are allied to Al-Qaeda in Syria. And so does Turkey, so does Saudi Arabia. And we know that the United States is helping the Saudis repeatedly bomb Yemen day and night, selling new weapons and aiding them in these operations. So the Americans, and we know that the Saudis are working with Al-Qaeda. So the Americans are continuing criminal acts. When the Saudis bomb countries, it's okay. When it's Assad, they say he's using barrel bombs. And one of the things about Syria is that while no one likes war, but no matter how many people in Syria have died, the ultimate responsibility is with those countries that created the civil war. Yeah. President Assad is an excuse. If it was killing demonstrators by Syrian police in Egypt, it was much worse after the coup on August 14th, 2013, where thousands of people were killed. No one tried to overthrow the Egyptian government, and the same is true in Turkey when they bombed their own citizens. It was because President Assad was opposed to U.S. policies in the region, and therefore the Americans created the civil war. So President Assad, the Syrian army, has no option but to resist, and the Russian Air Force is basically bombing the extremists that the Americans and the Europeans and the regional allies have created. So no one wants war, but if we want the bombing to stop, the only way to do it is for the United States to stop supporting extremists. Let me go to Alexander real quick. Believe that there's more blood on Obama's hands than anyone else.
I agree with that. I want to go to Alexander right before we go to the break here. Alexander, what's really interesting, I want to comment on what Mohammad just said there. I mean, the Saudis have plenty of planes and bombs to bomb Yemen, the Houthi, but they don't have planes and bombs apparently to fight ISIS. Okay, they're not doing it. It's the United States is doing it primarily. The French will throw in a few extra planes for for demonstration effect. But even America's own allies don't even participate in this war against terrorism. Go ahead.
Well, because the problem is that for the Saudis, they're not really interested. Their major priority is not to fight ISIS. It is to fight and overthrow Syria and ultimately Iran. And that is also the policy, if one looks at it carefully, that the US has been following. The US has consistently opposed the Syrian government. It has tried to support all kinds of groups that have been fighting the Syrian government. In 2013, it tried to bomb the Syrian government.
Okay, Alexander, let me jump in here. We're going to go to a short break. Gentlemen, after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on terrorism around the world. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent spat of terrorist attacks in the world. Okay, David, I'd like to go back to you in Charlottesville. I think one of the most important things to do in looking at all of these recent spat of terrorist attacks is who benefits from it all. Because when I looked at what Hollande had to say, then Cameron and the U.S. government, everybody's saying, well, we need to spend more money, maybe more troops, more defense outlays, more misery for the taxpayer, obviously. But it seems to me that, there's no learning from the experience of what's going on around us here. It's because I don't know. Is ISIS, ISIL, is it fighting back, lashing out outside its usual area of operation? I don't know here. But it seems to me that groups like ISIL and its affiliates, Al-Qaeda, and a lot of people in Washington, they have a nice symbiotic relationship. They give each other oxygen to breathe and to continue their own policies. Is that too simplistic for you?
I think that's very much to the point and is part of why the U.S. and other governments don't object to Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Middle East arming and fueling ISIS, and why the United States itself has been providing arms to allies of these groups and providing arms to the Iraqi government that are taken and to so-called moderates that surrender them and so forth. But to suggest that the United States should more forcefully attack ISIS and stop attacking the wrong people is to sort of miss the point that ISIS also benefits, along with the weapons makers and the security state. ISIS put out a full-length movie many months back now begging the United States to attack it. It attacks in Paris in order to provoke hostility. These airstrikes are the biggest recruitment tool for ISIS. And the idea that ISIS doesn't want to be bombed, doesn't want to be seen as the leading opponent of the foreign imperial aggressors, doesn't want people to come and be recruited to it as the native opposition to the outsiders. It misses the whole point. It is counterproductive. This is the other thing all of these former directors of national intelligence and #2 people at the CIA and generals say when they retire, is that it's counterproductive. You're making more enemies than you're killing. Yeah. And so, yes, the United States should stop the money flowing to ISIS, should stop the support for ISIS, should stop trying to overthrow Assad, and on. But it should have a complete. It shouldn't start bombing ISIS more. It's counterproductive on its own terms. We need a completely different approach of disarmament. Most of the weapons in the region are U.S.-made weapons.
Yeah. Everybody's using American weapons in this conflict here, all across the Middle East here. Somebody's making a killing here, quite literally. Mohammad, if I can go to you, I mean, one scenario that's out there, which is quite scary, is that the French may be cajoled by Washington to invoke the mutual security element of NATO because France says it's been attacked, it's in a state of war. And this is exactly what people in Washington, some people want in Washington, is they want a confrontation, and they will get it because that will be a confrontation against Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria. And from what I can tell, you're in Tehran. From what I can tell, the players that I just mentioned, they're not easily pushed around. And this is what scares me, because I don't see the Americans backing down. As a matter of fact, I think they may be upping the ante. What do you think?
Well, it's hard to imagine the French really going that far because, except for the United States, there's no country in NATO that really has that capability. The French,
no. They would be the reason. They would just be the trigger. I'm not saying no. I don't think the French are going to do anything more. I mean, they sent their aircraft carrier. Yeah, they sent it a few weeks ago. Everybody, okay? They didn't send it since the weekend. All right. The French don't have that kind of assets. What I'm saying is, the France could be used as a trigger for these hotheads in Washington to do what they really want, and they really want a much more intense, hot war. They want to take out Assad. They want to humiliate Russia, and they want to take on eventually Iran. Those objectives have not changed over the years. Go ahead.
You're correct. There are many people in Washington who think like the neocons, even though they may claim to be otherwise. Just like there are many people out there who are very much like Wahhabis, though they claim not to be. But I think that it's interesting that this sort of talk starts at, or they're making this sort of noise at a time when Iranian forces, Syrian forces, Iraqi forces, Lebanese Hezbollah troops, along with the Russian air support and Syrian government and Iraqi government air support, are making such headway.
Yep.
The militants, Al-Qaeda, which is just as dangerous as ISIL, and we shouldn't forget that. The Americans and their allies continue to allow them to thrive, and they allow them to be supported through an organization called Jaish al-Fath, which is an umbrella organization for different Al-Qaeda affiliates. So while these groups, along with ISIL, are taking a beating right now, and they're being defeated on all the different fronts almost simultaneously, suddenly this sort of talk sounds very suspicious.
Yeah, Alexander, I think, unfortunately, the cynic in me says that cynicism is running amok right now in Washington because they see this as another opportunity. They're not mourning the deaths in Paris. They're not mourning the Russians that were destroyed in the sky. They're looking for an opportunity to change their position to get the same goal. And this is what terrifies me, because every time these people do something like this, it ends up with more failure, and it spreads even further afield, okay? And this is setting the entire region aflame. And at the same time, John Kerry says this is an opportunity for peace talks at Vienna. I don't see the two being in common in any way, shape, or form. Go ahead.
Well, if you actually looked at what happened at the G20 summit, Obama and Cameron both spoke to Putin. And the interesting thing was that what they both said to him at that summit was stop supporting President Assad by bombing the people who oppose President Assad, refocus everything away from that, and basically join us. And that is exactly, in effect,
it's not going to happen.
It's not going to. Well, one, it's not going to happen, but perhaps more to the point, it bears out your point that their objectives have not really changed, and they're trying to use these various events, the Russian airliner tragedy, the Paris attacks, to provide justifications for doing what they have always planned to do and what they've been trying to do, in effect, for the last 4 years. There is one point I want to say, though, which is this, that ISIL is, whether we like it or not, a military force. I don't think it is possible not to confront ISIL militarily at this time. The problem is that if you're going to confront ISIL militarily, you have to do it on the basis of an intelligent and workable political strategy. That means that you have to ally yourself with those people in the area who are resisting it. And it also means that you can't go on through your other hand, in effect, supporting it. Unless you do that, then obviously bombing ISIL isn't going to do much good. But if you start doing it more intelligently, perhaps you can.
Go ahead, Mohammad and Tehran, jump in. Go ahead.
In addition, they have to be honest in fighting extremism. In other words, if they fight ISIS, the only thing that will happen if it is somehow defeated, let's say the West suddenly becomes honest about it, then many of these groups are going to join the other extremists, like the Nusra Front and others. And the Americans continue to support them. So if we want to eradicate extremism, all these terrorist organizations that are fighting in Syria have to be dealt with, and those countries that are supporting them have to be dealt with. And the ideology that is being used to create this extremism, Wahhabism, which is exported by the Saudi regime, has to be dealt with. The mosques in Paris, many of them are funded by Saudi Arabia. And instead of calling Muslims the problem, the United States and the European governments have to blame themselves, because they've allied themselves with the Saudi regime. They've allowed the Saudis to export extremist ideologies, and then they blame ordinary Muslims who sent their kids to the local mosque not knowing how they're going to be trained there. So if anyone is guilty for exporting extremism, it is the United States, the Europeans, and their regional allies. If they wanted to stop, they have to stop these regimes and to stop all the militant groups with the ideology.
David, does the U.S. have the political will to do that? Because it seems impossible, at least publicly, for them to say no to Saudi Arabia. I mean, what's going on in Yemen is just a horrific war crime. I mean, on a massive scale. But you wouldn't know that by watching CNN, would you? You wouldn't know that by watching BBC. The U.S. is culpable, giving them intelligence, everything they need to fight one of the poorest countries in the world. Why? Why do they do that? Because they need the Saudis for something else? Is it for oil anymore? I mean, the thing is that the United States doesn't have any moral standing anymore to say it's fighting terrorism when it supports regimes like that.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, and part of why recruitment is easy for groups like Nusra and ISIS, and why recruitment soars with these air attacks. The United States needs to look at, all the way back to Afghanistan in the 70s, but look in particular at the invasion of Iraq as what laid the basis for all of this, and adopt a policy of reparations, of withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the region, and of massive reparations to the region, including green energy. I mean, we're talking about nations that, yes, sell oil to the United States, but they're going to be uninhabitable this century if we continue down this course. And this climate conference in Paris, they're already talking about scaling it back and trimming it down and avoiding protests and demonstrations because there's a need to escalate wars. And that's more important, apparently, than preserving a habitable climate on this planet.
David, I'm going to have to jump in here. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Absolutely fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests in Tehran, Charlottesville, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.